Earlier, I spoke with American University professor Emilio Viano. He's an author and expert in the field of transnational crime, and he explains why stricter gun control laws won't stop violence and how other countries around the world compare to the U.S. on this issue.
Internationally, there is a lot of difference. There are some countries that control guns, very, very tightly, like China, for example. But there are other countries where the laws are fairly lax, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a higher rate of homicide or of violence. So it is more than gun control. It is also culture. If we want to talk about a country where there is guns and a lot of violence, we should think probably of Brazil, where even though there are about 100 million people less than in the US, there are thousands of homicides every year more.
What is it about the United States, though, when we hear about these mass shootings that have been going on here? Why don't we hear about them in other countries then?
Well, they are not just limited to the US. They've happened in Norway most recently. They've happened in England not too long ago. They've happened also in France. It is not a specialty of the US, but it happens fairly frequently or not infrequently in the United States. I think that it has to do in part with the culture of violence that is very much part of the mindset in the US. In other words, we should look more and beyond having guns. It is also, why do we use them? There is a whole history of using guns, of violence, of people killing each other for territory, for money, for power. And it continues today. Think, for example, of the fact that the US is at war now for 10 years in Afghanistan. It was until recently in Iraq. It is now using drones to kill enemies all over the world, including US citizens. It is a country that often espouses armed intervention to settle disputes and to supposedly export democracy and human rights. What example does that give to the people of the country? That if you have a dispute, if you have to settle something, violence is the way to do it, because we do it at the governmental level too. So I think that in part it is a question of the culture we live in. And for example, this movie on Batman also is very much connected to violence, to conflict, to obviously the conflict between good and evil. The good eventually triumphs, but there is indeed a lot of fighting going on in the movie, in the series. So in a sense, I think that there is a culture of violence that permeates our lives, and some people are more vulnerable to it than others.
So it doesn't sound like gun control or stricter controls are the answer. What do you think is the answer here? Well,
certainly some controls, and probably stricter controls that we have at this time in the US, might be advisable, even though constitutionally it would be very difficult to totally ban guns in the USA. But I think that there is also a culture change that has to take place. In other words, promoting more alternative dispute resolutions, cultivating a culture that supports peaceful ways of resolving disputes, disagreements, the desire to be first, the desire to be famous, that it is not always based on being aggressive, because aggressiveness is very much an American trait. And this is a cultural trait that, as I said, has to start changing from the very top of our government down. And that will not be easy, because obviously the culture of the country is for aggressive, forceful, and threatening intervention to dominate the enemy and defeat it. And therefore, I'm not too optimistic that we will have a lot of change coming. There will be, of course, calls for tightening the rules, calls for making it more difficult to obtain guns, but that is not the answer, or is not the only answer.
Emilio Viano, thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thank you very much for inviting me.